Hello everyone, this is your professor Wang Dewei, also known as Tewei Wang. This lecture is about chapter number 5 from the textbook from Spurrier and Toppy. Chapter 5 has a very central message, that is, how to select a project approach for your system development project. We use the word approach here, but as a matter of fact, in most of the situations, we will use the terminology called methodology in system development projects. System development methodology has basically two different categories. The first category is so-called the plan-driven category. The second category is the agile category. And of course, like many strategic selections, there's always something in between the plan-driven and agile. Sometimes we call them hybrid methodology. The plan-driven methodology is derived from the traditional project management practice. Recall from your project management course, you probably remember something called a Gantt chart, project management, using Gantt chart to control the time progress of the project, or critical path method, or PERT, project management. All these project management methods is some sort of a top-down method, use a planned mechanism to control the resources and time and the completion of the project. Now the same logic used in software development become so-called the traditional plan-driven methodologies. This example including system development lifecycle concept and the waterfall methodology. Some of those earlier thinking also have something called the spiral methodology, phased methodology, stage methodology. All of them are very similar. And as you can probably see from the slide, that it was very popular before the 1990s. Actually, I would argue that before the 1980s. And the end result is there are a lot of this project failure software project failure associated with this traditional method. And people start realizing that traditional project management is probably not a good methodology or method or approach used to manage information system development project. And I'll argue that the main reason for such failure is the unpredictability of the information system project. So over the past 30 years or so, from 1990s to today, many different methodology has been revised and developed throughout the process. Among them, there are also so-called architecture and platform or framework that have been proposed. And some of them use the terminology called the models to represent a method of building information system and manage the information system project. So in our extra material discussion, we will discuss the so-called quality movement of the system management project, such as CMMI, or some of the IT governance model, such as COVID number 5. But in here, let's focus on the more central to the software development methodology. And in the category of agile, you see there are two examples showing up here. One is called the extreme programming, that is coming from the computer science community, building the project from a very technical perspective, evolve into a more customer or client oriented concern. And from the quality and the project management environment, this methodology called the Scrum has been developed, involved, and defined very well in today's agile methodology world. Other similar concern or thinkings, such as the Motorola's Six Sigma, that sort of certifications are part of the process as well. And in our discussion on the architecture such as Zachman model derived from the earlier IBM engineer is also an example of the blending between the methodology and the overall thinking of the system design into a whole framework. And nowadays, the methodology, the typical choice of methodology is usually not so-called traditional plan-based or plan-driven methodology, or the pure agile methodology. It's more or less likely to be something called a hybrid methodology or hybrid approach using the textbook's terminology. Hybrid approach is a combination of a plan-driven, and usually in a large project, you will have a very solid plan, very similar to a traditional project management process. You start with a very conceptual level discussion and all the way to implementation and the management of the revision. But in the process, starting from very conceptual, very earlier stage of strategic thinking, all the way to technical detail, in between there is a coming back and forth, and the terminology we use is iterative process. So you're going to be going through many cycle of conceptual thinking and doing a little bit of implementation and come back to discuss conceptually, and that process of coming back and forth become a norm of today's project management in system development. An example such as this that we discussed in previous chapter talking about building user interface, and building user interface is a practice of iterative, and you are using a physical feature or prototype of some sort to soliciting user requirement. At the same time, you also verify your prototype and thinking using an abstract model such as domain models or the user story to cross-reference from top-down and method of project planning to the small, quick build-up type of prototype to verify each other. That process of going back and forth within the project is called a hybrid methodology. Now, in the IBM framework, or I should say the IBM rational framework, there is an architecture or so-called methodology called unified process, and that unified process is basically this type of a hybrid methodology. And hybrid methodology usually have a set of so-called big requirement upfront or broad that driven the entire project planning. But in between, it allow some of the requirement be modified and going through the iteration, so you can have changes, smaller changes in the process of implementation or design. This is especially important for a project go through a very long time to implement. Say, for example, if you are implementing an ERP system, which is a large project in the typical organization, it usually requires somewhere between 1 year to 2 years to complete. That is actually very short. Some of the organization would take like 3 to 5 years in the earlier time, back in the 1990s, to complete an ERP project. In a large project like ERP project, that technology changed over time. Say, for example, the operation system that we use or the Office product that we use from say Microsoft or Apple, their operation system undergo frequent changes. Windows has this typical cycle of every 3 years. They have a new version of Microsoft Windows. Say you probably remember Windows number 7, Windows 10. That's actually every 3 years. And Windows 10 is also under constant changes in terms of the feature and updates. So every time the environment change, your information system have to change as well. In the not too long ago, a focus of the software development is on the website, and that was in the 2000 to 2010. But today we are seeing that the development of software is more on the mobile device, or the combination of the traditional website and mobile device. And this is actually one of the reasons we moved to the Canvas system as our learning platform. So all these factors leads to this hybrid method become almost like a choice for the big project. So clearly saying that when we are looking at the system development project, or if you work as a business analyst or a project manager in an IT organization, you are facing three basic type of choices. plan-driven or agile or hybrid. And plan-driven is suitable for something more stable, more predictable. Say, for example, in today's environment, if you are building a website, a visibility website, meaning that you are just showing your company on the web and let people know about your company. That type of project is very stable, very typical, and you can have a big requirement upfront and big design upfront as well. And going through a very simple, straightforward step-by-step process, that fits very well to a plan-driven project. But however, if you are handled with something very new, very unpredictable, say if you're going to be using, say, a facial recognition technology in some sort of a thing, and nobody really know what the facial recognition technology will impact your software and behavior in human being. So when you are building a new design, you probably use more or less a trial and error method and do a little bit, try a little bit, and before you make a big decision moving forward. And this is probably an example of initial exploration stage for new technology. You do more on the agile methodology concept and approach. And contrast to the project-driven method, agile methodology usually start with not a big requirement, something have to be done that is strategic important. Instead, it comes from a very small modification, small changes to your software requirement. Say, for example, if you look at our Canvas, you're saying, well, maybe the link we see in Canvas is not that clear. Can we change that to like a button instead of a manual driven system? And that small changes in system does not affect your software that much in terms of functionality and performance, but it will increase the perception and help the usability of the software. That small requirement are usually good candidate for the agile methodology. And every time you have a small changes, you build something new and you test it, go through this little cycle, and we call that iteration. And that is a typical suitable project for agile methodology. In compared to your project management or quality management concept, the agile methodology is very similar to this total quality management concept of continuous improvement. So every day you will think about how do you improve your system or project or process in a small way. You know, we're gonna be what's we gonna be doing in the next week or next month, and can we modify our software or reconfigure our software or purchase a new software to help. Now, and after 1 month we test it. If it doesn't work, let's change to another method. So this small step continuous improvement model is agile. On the other hand, the re-engineering big project changes, and in 1 year we're going to be switching from a total, say, human reporting system to an artificial intelligence reporting system. That big dramatic changes in system redesign will be more or less matched to the concept of re-engineering type of project management. From the textbook framework perspective, we are looking at the junction between we know a high level abstraction user story requirement concept, and we need to start working on the project, and we need to select a management process in between. Most of the so-called software development tool that has this management or requirement management feature, and we have already performed some of those in our class discussion or assignment, talking about the different tools such as IBM provided, IBM Rational or IBM Doors. Those type of requirement management and project management tools are used in the selection of your methodology as well. So we are in this junction of planning your project and how are we going to be executing the project. Simply saying from another perspective of how we're going to be selecting the methodology, we go more toward this plan-driven traditional project management, or go for a more agile or somewhere in between. And this decision can be considered from two dimensions: requirement and when are you going to be collecting the requirement, how often the requirement will be changed, and construction, how long the process of the construction, how difficult it is to build the software. Usually, the bigger, the more rigid of your project requirement, and the bigger the project, bigger the software to build, you go more toward the plan driven. But the smaller requirement and subject to change, or the more sort of a short-term project will go more on the agile methodology side. But all software project has some similarity. That is, software project is still more unpredictable than a typical project, say, such as design a machine to production line management. And so usually that the true question about project selection in software development environment, in today's environment, is not three options. It's more agile versus hybrid. Totally plan driven has been already thrown out of the window already. And so let's revisit the hybrid methodology a little bit. So basically, in hybrid methodology, you do have some sort of a large long-term requirement and goal you want to achieve. This is represented by the BRUF or BDUF. BRUF's big requirement upfront, or BDUF, big design upfront. And these two terminology describe that there is a ultimate goal, or sort of like a very clear vision of what the software would look like, but not the solid vision. It's a big, clear vision, but at the same time, it also subject to some changes at the front. So based on that guiding principle, guiding requirement, and you start going through this agile cycle or iteration to achieve the final goal. And this is a process we usually adopt in a typical organization project. Simple notes on the two terminology called the BRUF and BDUF. BRUF is usually talking about the conceptual requirement. It's a perspective of design coming from requirement. On the other hand, BDUF or BDUF is a terminology used to describe that your vision or the project is coming from the technology that you have envisioned already. So one is coming from design, the other is from analysis. So BDUF is already, say for example, you see somebody else's credit card company, you run a credit card company, you see another credit card company deliver a dashboard financial analysis for their client every month when they receive their statement. And you say, well, we're going to be doing something similar to that. So you already have a plan, a clear vision of what your software be able to do. And that is called a BDUF. It's a physical implementation. But on the other hand, if you only have a concept, I'm going to give my customer, credit card customer, a very good report every week. But how are we going to be building that report? I don't know. That's called BRUF. So these two are coming. One is more from a physical finish up product. The other one is more conceptual requirement. But both of them become a guiding principle of your project. And then we derive little iteration to achieve the big goal, and that is a process of hybrid. So again, to summarize, typically that you have the smaller project or changing requirement, you go for the agile methodology. But typically we go for the hybrid in a typical organization, because organization require the project be going on forever, but somehow you need to control this through smaller project in between. And this is a large and a clear and slow changing requirement. We go for the hybrid choice. And your author proposed a model. How do you evaluate and make decisions on what kind of approach you're going to be using in your project? It's called a home ground model. It uses a profile method based on 3 dimensions. One dimension is called the functional requirements. The second dimensional is a non-functional requirement. The third dimension is the team, the people you have in your project team. based on the complexity of your functional requirement, complexity of your non-functional requirement, and the characteristic of your teams. Then use the combination of the three characteristics and decided on what is the best approach for your project management. And to analyze and evaluate the different criteria of how to select the project management method, it will be helpful that you can use a template like this. This is actually, aside from the details of what they presented in three categories in terms of functional requirement, non-functional requirement, team characteristic. There's another thing I like to draw your attention to. A tabulate analysis such as this one and such as the assignment that you have been received to compare company or compare software is a very useful analytic skill. And look at our name of the course called System Analysis and Design. So whenever you try to analyze something, and based on our human brain construction, the limitation of human brain, using a tabulate comparison is a very powerful and useful way. So using a tabulate method here, we create three categories using rows and column to compare the features, and this will give you a more or less overall understanding of the system characteristic and be able to make a proper judgment accordingly. So now you can see that a very long comparison between the agile method and the hybrid method. What are the features of each category? Roughly saying, I believe you can read the detail. Roughly saying, the again agile methodology move toward more smaller, more ambiguous project, and hybrid move more for a larger and more clear defined objective and goal. And it has application on the requirement as well as on the team composition. And plotting the three category in a more visualizing form become something what we call the radar chart. Radar chart, by the way, I am a professor doing one of my main research area is data visualization. Radar chart is one of the tools we use to create something what we call the profile. So profile is a method of building the fit between one category to another category. In this case, we are creating a profile of the requirement to fit into a methodology. Right. So, and visually you can see that in this case will be more like a star profile. So it will have a spike on certain category evenly. And what does this tell you is that you can have some sort of a in-between methodology. And if you have more like a full-blown heavy emphasis on the functional requirement, large in many categories, almost like expanded ball, this will go more for a plane-driven or more on the hybrid plane-driven side of the methodology, and also implication on the different category of the profile and the requirement. Say functional requirement usually require a strong team. The team need to be very good because you are building a lot of these functional requirement in terms of the complexity, in terms of the stability of your feature. Then you need a good team to actually a good size of the team to actually manage those complexity. And of course, this is a way of visualizing the trade-off between team size, functionality, and non-functional requirement. And there is no clear answer that says, okay, if functional requirement is high, the team have to be high. It's subject to the discussion of your real situation and come up with a profile that fits into your project. And this is another example. After a team meeting, you probably decided on we have relatively more like a smaller team and a smaller project. In this case, you see that the whole profile is smaller, and we have a relatively small and not so talented team. So you're dealing with a small changes, and it's probably fit better to the agile project or agile methodology. On the other hand, you have a very critical, complicated functional requirement and non-functional requirement. You probably will need a large team as well with a very large team size, and then you'll have more like a plan-driven methodology. And this one is a typical BROF project or BROF methodology. You have a very clear and highly complicated functional requirement, while the non-functional requirement is not that necessary. Say, for example, a lot of times says, okay, if your organization is going to be using a communication method, and your boss come out and says, okay, I'm an Apple supporter, so every one of my company need to use Apple iPhone. That particular statement is something what we call the non-functional requirement. It's not related to your business function, but it is related to your technology choice. So once your boss says, we're going to be using Apple, we're not going to be using any Android technology, then you are moving toward the other side around. But in this case, we're focusing on the function. It's moving more toward the breadth. And because it does not specify which technology you're going to be using, and typically we go for more like a highly planned methodology on this particular. If you move to the other side, it will be the example I mentioned earlier. I'm going to be using Apple, not something else. So you specify the technology, you specify how importance of the mission of your technology already, instead of describing the functionality or what you want iPhone to do. And that's the other side of requirement. A lot of this non-functional requirement, you probably can see that has some sort of political feasibility and some of these sort of coordination feasibility flavor in there, so that you're looking at a compromise in this organization management compared to the technology adoption. Another way to compare the functionality requirement more visually is, of course, using the most commonly line or bar chart. In this case, we're using a line chart to describe the trade-off between the cost of requirement changes and the software construction time. And usually that in some project, the requirement changes will cost more. Then you probably move for the plan. You will set up the requirement up front, and that's not changes, and follow a very structured methodology. On the other hand, if change of the requirement is very cheap, and then you can go the other way around that, go for the agile methodology. Similarly, you can use other criteria to compare and contrast the methodology. In this particular example, we're looking at the vertical axis represent the completeness and accuracy of your software project. And on the horizontal, you see the time for software construction. And completeness and accuracy tie again directly to the clarity of your requirement. The higher of your clarity of your requirement, the more completeness and accuracy is required in this particular project. So you will go for more a plan-driven. But the completeness and accuracy is not that easy to define. You go the other way around for the agile methodology. It is not necessary to use the so-called radar chart to generate profile, or to use this two-dimensional line chart or some sort of bar chart to compare and contrast. And the textbook uses these two methodologies to try to tell you that during the decision-making process, and which is actually the ultimate goal of why you are learning information system in the curriculum. When you make a decision, you need to consider and evaluate and base your decision on multiple criteria. And it is always to look at the criteria from different perspectives. And using the supporting tools such as the radar chart, the tabulate method that we look at the beginning, and as well as this line or pie chart method, will be a good idea to compare and contrast your criteria. And at the end, you as a human being, you have to argue at the end to decide on what methodology you are going to be selecting. And Going through the more systematic process like this, tabulated radar chart, presenting criteria, and that you can be a more systematic decision maker. And also that in this process, if you are looking at the individual career perspective, this will help you to organize and make your thinking process more logical. And I think that is the ultimate goal for the system analysis design. And in most of the business school, we have one ultimate learning objective for all of our students. It's called critical thinking. And, but if you think about it, what does that mean by critical thinking? How do you become critical? You have to be systematic to become critical. You want to be critical, you have to convince people that you are logical and convincing. A model and architectural framework, in this case, we're talking about the framework, like the textbook framework and the selection framework, give you the reference and category for you to start with. And from there, considering your own organization situation or the problem you try to solve, and you decide on the different criteria and different dimension you want to compare and contrast. But the essence is learn how to use this chart and tables and the diagram to facilitate your thinking, and that will make your decision even better. One last thing, again, our focus here is to select between the agile methodology and the hybrid project-driven type of methodology and how we make decisions. And you have to understand also your choices, how many of these different options are out there, and what we should do about it when we are facing a project management situation. All right, thank you for listening. Talk to you in another lecture.